To hire one professor in an American university could take 2 or 3 years. How can we attract top professors to KSC?
The part of his salary was something like 80K per year, which is a lot by Ukrainian standards.
Producing people that, in fact, are totally unprepared for the job market.
People from government, they also come and teach. And for German, it was almost like a red flag.
Oh, the Davis Center is too pro-Ukrainian. You need to have some pro-Russian voices also. And so Harvard yesterday said no.
They want to be a rector of the university, but we will give you less money than usual.
I'm going to give you $1 million so that for the next 30 years, this podcast can continue to survive.
All right. Well, welcome, everyone. This is KSC Podcast, where we discuss education, science, and how Ukrainian universities fit to the global arena of education. And today we have, a friend, a guest, a colleague, Alexandra Vakru. She has PhD in governance and political science. And for 15 years, you were leading, you were executive director at the Davis Center at Harvard University, which is a very well-known and prestigious place. And now you work here at Kyiv School of Economics as vice president of something important.
Strategic engagement.
Strategic engagements, of course. Well, basically the idea is that I asked you to discuss the differences or similarities between Harvard and Kyiv School of Economics, how things work here, how things work in Harvard. I don't really know where this podcast will go, but I just hope we can talk about your experiences in the United States, in Ukraine, and we can, share our views on how education works or should work.
Sounds great.
Sound great. Okay. Yeah, I really wanted to talk about small things, like how do you do things in Harvard? Basically, I would be really interested to know how you actually decide on what to teach and what not to teach. Given that Harvard is a very old and prestigious university, I assume there is some kind of shadow, some gravitas of, the legacy, and you have to do things as it used to be, as Harvard usually does things, but you also have to innovate. So how do you decide what should be taught, what should not be taught? Who is a decision maker? How do you do these things?
One of the interesting features about Harvard, which is a private university, that's very important, is that it's extremely decentralized, even compared to other private universities. So decision-making, fundraising, hiring is all done very much at the local department level. When it comes to choosing which classes are going to be offered, the departments are responsible for developing the majors and the minors. In other words, the degrees that students can graduate with. Usually they have to take 8 classes. And the department will decide amongst the faculty members which 8 classes should be required or 8 subjects should be required, get approval from some higher level committee, and then offer those classes. But let's say the class is Introduction to American Politics, which would be a basic class for a political science degree. It can be taught in an infinite number of ways. And there, it's likely the professor is going to decide what he or she thinks is important about American politics and should be included in that class. So there is no one at a higher level that says, okay, now we're going to teach constitutional law and every student is going to take constitutional law. The faculty would revolt because the decision-making happens at a much lower level.
But how is it connected with basically, labor market and what markets need, what governments need? I mean, here in Ukraine, we used to think about, that basically there is an economy and we need to prepare engineers or historians because there is a demand for that. And if the professor comes up with an idea, I'm a sociologist and I want to teach sociology. People will ask questions, but why should we start sociology class? Will these students have a job on the market? Whether government need that, whether donors need that. So there must be some sort of a process to think about these consequences, and someone has to make a decision. Should we allow this guy to teach sociology or should we not allow? So do you do something like that at the level of provost or at the level of Ministry of Education, or I don't know?
Oh, no. So the decision about whether or not, Mr. Professor can teach his class on sociology as he wants to is made by him with the department perhaps signing off on it. But the department is unlikely, the department chair, who's a faculty member who has a 3-year term, is unlikely to say, you know what, I really don't like that reading. You should include that reading. That would be considered incredibly invasive. But the larger question is one that society is extremely preoccupied with right now, which is, are universities, is higher education in its own ivory tower, is the usual cliche, and producing people that in fact are totally unprepared for the job market? Isn't the job of the university to prepare people to be productive members of society? And there are two answers to that, right? One is teaching people how to think by making sure they have exposure to different subjects is how you prepare productive members of society. The other argument is that nobody is forcing students to take that class from Mr. Professor. If they decide that computer scientists are getting the best jobs, the highest paying jobs, then they will go and they will take a major in computer science rather than, let's say, Latin studies. And that, in fact, is what's happening at most universities. You see a shift away from people majoring in the humanities and even the social sciences and going towards the STEM fields like computer science and engineering.
Yeah. So I guess a part of this question is also about the money. There is always a question of financial sustainability. So Professor X wants to launch a class or teach a class, but there is always a question, do we have salaries to pay to these professors? Yeah. And as far as I understand, private universities, they generate money from tuition fees, but also from donors, also from some research funding. Can you talk about that? And also maybe you can discuss a bit what just happened in Harvard, with respect to these threats from the administration and the response of Harvard.
So another small question.
Small question, yeah.
So one of the things that's important to remember is that the pressures on a private university will be different from those on a public university. And one thing that's interesting is public university, a state university, like let's say University of Indiana, might only get 12% of its salary or its budget covered from public funding because gradually over time, public funding has decreased. So they're still considered a state university, even though the amount they get from state entities, federal or state, is very small. In those cases, they often have a criteria that a class has to generate a certain number of students per salary or per cost of the class. So the professors have an incentive to put bodies in seats to make sure that they have enough students in their class to justify the teaching of the class. In private universities, it's usually not that much pressure. When faculty are hired, tenure track faculty are hired. They're hired for 7 years. And the idea is they might be asked to teach a few required classes that are big, like Introduction to Biology, but they'll also be able to teach 1 or 2 classes that relate to their research. And the mandatory classes could have 200 kids in them, and the specialized classes, might have 8 or 3. And a private university usually has the long-term funding that allows it to subsidize those smaller classes with the bigger classes. But every university has a different mix of funding sources. And in fact, every school at Harvard has 11 schools, has a different mix. So at the biggest universities, there's endowment funding.
Yeah.
Harvard has a $35 billion endowment, or maybe it's bigger than that. But that's pretty unusual. That might be the top 10 schools. Then you have funding from grants, research grants.
Can you tell what endowment is?
Yeah. So endowment is basically a huge savings account. Donors give money, and the money usually has some kind of purpose. So, for example, this could be the Timothy Brook podcast, and I'm going to give you $1 million so that for the next 30 years, this podcast can continue to survive. The problem is that $1 million is then invested somewhere, and you will only get to spend 5% of that to support your podcast. So you'll never get into the principal, the main sum, but you'll be able to spend some of the interest that's earned.
Yeah, and university leadership is not allowed to transfer this money to something else. It is podcast and only the podcast.
So in the past, the terms were usually very specific, right? So you give a scholarship, for example, for financial aid to students that are a descendant of a specific person who lived on a ranch in Montana. And that money can only go to that person's descendants. Universities really don't like that because then a lot of your endowment is locked up in things. And like if you have nobody from that Montana family who's going to Harvard, you can't spend that money on someone else. So more and more universities have turned to endowment terms that say the money is supposed to go to this, but at the discretion of the dean, it could be spent on that. So I would say in the last 10 years, there's been a movement towards that, but that means that still most of Harvard's $35 billion is going to be locked up in other funds. Very inconvenient, because then you have a crisis. It's extremely difficult to do that. It's a legal question, basically, because you had a contract, you received the money under certain conditions, and now you want to break that contract, and the donor might be dead, right? So it's very complicated. But apart from endowment, you have tuition revenue, which usually is not that much. It does not cover the costs. You have research grants. So faculty usually individually apply for grants to private or public entities to get funding for their research. And then you could have other activities like executive education, for example. So you offer a one-week class and you charge business people $10,000 to attend the class.
And when you say they get money from public institution, basically it means government. So the government...
Yeah, like National Science Foundation, for example, or Department of Education, for example, gives money to universities in order to fund students who will take less commonly taught languages that the U.S. government is interested in, like Urdu, Pashto, Ukrainian, all of those languages where people might not naturally choose to study them. They give awards so that people will have financial aid in order to study them.
And that's how current administration actually can pressure the universities, because basically they say you have this money from public institutions, public foundations, and we can cut this funding, something like that.
Exactly. So what's happened now with the Trump administration, first with Columbia University and then with Harvard, is that the government has said, well, we give you millions or even billions of dollars in money for, usually it's medical research and science research, because that's what's most expensive. And it's not that you just deserve this money, right, and then can do whatever you want. You need to have policies that are consistent with what we want. And so we're not going to just give money because you're doing an amazing experiment on mice genetics. We're going to give you the money to do research on mice genetics as long as you're ensuring that there aren't anti-Semitic policies and people wearing masks at protests. And what the universities are saying is that, first of all, we're not just getting the money as a blank check. We're getting it for specific research projects, which usually have to do with public health and virus research and things like that. And second of all, because of the Constitution and the right to free speech and things like that, students and faculty and anyone else should be allowed to say what they think and not have consequences. Columbia basically gave in and said, okay, we'll make changes. And Harvard yesterday got a very detailed 4-page letter from the Trump administration, which said things like, if you don't have a diversity of opinions in every department, not defined, then you need to appoint someone to hire new people to ensure diversity of opinion. So just so we understand what this could mean, like if it's Middle Eastern studies, for example, like let's say you're seen as being too pro-Palestinian, now they want you to hire some pro-Israeli professors. But what my question
Quotas.
Yes, basically, so that you have equality of opinions. But it could also mean, for example, that, the Davis Center is too pro-Ukrainian. You need to have some pro-Russian voices also, right? There's no limit to what people are going to say constitutes diversity of opinion. So Harvard yesterday said no. And because Harvard is the wealthiest university, it can afford to. And in fact, I would argue that it had to, because there is no way that it can accept the conditions that were in that letter and remain Harvard.
Yeah, actually, somehow I was looking for something like this to happen. I actually wanted universities to show some leadership and to show their position. It's not like, I understand I'm Ukrainian, I cannot influence domestic policies in another country, but I still have my own opinions. Yeah, and I was curious whether universities would kind of give in or revolt, and it seems like the Harvard has shown this strong position. I'm quite happy to see that universities have this agency, but how do you think? It is a good thing? It is a bad thing? I don't know. How do you think about that?
Well, one thing that has influenced the way I think about it is something you said, right? You said, look, when we had the full-scale invasion, we did everything we could to save KSC, right? We cut our salaries. We made sure we had shelters. We had, heat and water so students could be here all the time. We met the moment. And you were asking me a month ago, like, why isn't anybody at the universities in the United States also saying, okay, forget your federal funding. We have more important principles. But maybe you could say a little bit about how you were thinking about that when the full-scale invasion started.
Yes. So basically the context of the conversation is that I was surprised that, in my opinion, American universities were kind of too soft and didn't reveal a lot of leadership, because when the invasion started in Ukraine, I think it was just a clear moment that priorities were so aligned and so clear. People were just thinking about our own lives and our own safety, but also immediately, like the next thing after thinking of our lives, we also were thinking about our students, our data, our research. I remember then one of my first emails during the first day of the invasion was that I was texting to my colleagues who are pollsters, sociologists, and I was texting an email saying like, oh, hey friends, I know the war is going on, but can you please archive all the data and send it to me? Because we might need to preserve our data. We're scholars, we're researchers, we want to preserve what we do. And we believe that, education matters. Even during the war, we need to preserve talent, we need to preserve human capital to survive. So the question is, how do you survive? And we put, we were very strategic, very pragmatic. As you said, we had to work with the resources we had. We had to cut salaries. I actually became the rector of the university in the moment when we put cap on salaries. So it was a job offer, like, hey, do you want to be a rector of the university, but we will give you less money than usual. So yeah, that was just the reality. And we had to push back against some international advisors. We actually had a lot of internal discussions, because one of the advices was to move to Poland, for instance. So, we had to collect basically all the resources we had. We also had to negotiate with some donors, because we had donors who gave us money on some specific stuff. But we said like, look guys, we have to spend money on other things now. We will spend money on shelters now, not on this educational program. And it was risky, but I think there was no choice. We had to conduct these negotiations. So that's why this experience kind of informed or influenced my perception. So I assumed that people in Harvard would do something like that. They would just barricade themselves, and they will say, forget it, we have our endowment, we have a lot of money, we will do what we want, and then we will apologize later. And something like this is kind of happening now. I don't know what's going to happen with other universities. I understand that other universities don't have so much resources, but I also think it's not so much about resources as about leadership. So yeah, so we'll see. But
and I should say that the other universities are looking at Harvard. I mean, the initial reaction yesterday was, thank God. Right? That Harvard, which can afford to be in the front of the fight, is doing this, because it's much easier to fall in behind Harvard than to try and fight if you know that Harvard already caved in.
Yeah, I wonder what people in Columbia are thinking now. Like, yeah.
They're not very happy.
So, and what's your impression from being in Ukraine? So, you have this huge experience of working in Harvard, of finding students, creating programming, working with donors, and here you are in Ukraine now. Do you feel any? How are you? How are you here?
Well, thank you for asking. Honestly, the work here is so meaningful and so powerful, in part because my colleagues, the professors, the staff, the students are incredible. And one of the things I noticed, you'll remember I came to Ukraine in the summer of 2023, just for a week to kind of get a feeling. And I came here and I met with you and some students, and we were talking. It was just when Prigozhin, I think, was marching on Moscow. And I remember having this conversation and thinking, wow, the students are so engaged compared to some of the conversations I have at Harvard. And I took that back, and I was thinking, why is it that in the moment in Ukraine, people feel united with a sense of purpose behind education, right? That education is part of the solution to our problem. That yes, Russia has invaded. It's terrible. Like what's happening on the front line is grotesque. But what we can do as academics and scholars is make sure that we are training the students that are going to be able to preserve Ukraine afterwards. And the sense of mission is one that I would say is very diluted at Harvard, right? And it's normal. It's been around for 400 years. It has a lot of momentum. But, turning Harvard or getting Harvard to think differently about the world, whether it's about war or AI or something else, it's like moving the Titanic. It moves very, very slowly, and it's very, very bureaucratic.
Yeah.
Whereas the culture at KSC, and to some extent in Ukraine, is more like a startup, right? Like we have this problem. Okay, like how can we find a solution quickly and gradually improve on it until it's a really good solution?
But of course, it's nice to hear your thoughts. I'm very pleased that you have this reaction to our students, but I want to push back a bit because I have a slightly conflicting thoughts, and I wanted to run it by you and hear what you think. So the way it works now at KC, as far as I understand and see it, is that quite a lot depends on the leadership of universities. So deans, rectors, president, board, they're quite engaged in thinking which programs to launch or which programs not to launch. Because right now things are kind of fuzzy. So there is no good market and research in Ukraine. The demand, you don't really know the demand because, we live in the country of war. We don't know which industries will be big, which industries will not, what students want, what parents want. So we have to kind of guess things. So we do our best estimates. And for instance, we understand, it's our evaluation, that maybe when the war ends, we'll need a lot of people to rebuild Ukraine. So it makes sense to invest in programs in engineering. So it's a safe choice. There will be a market, there will be international investments, we'll need a lot of people. So it's kind of an organic decision to launch the program. So it doesn't come from faculty, it comes more from the leadership of the university, from our strategy, and then we build a program. And I like it. It allows us to be flexible. We make interesting decisions. It's also interesting how you negotiate things, how you do quick market research as far as you can. And, you should convince donors. You should convince your board to unlock the resources. So it's a lot of fun in a way. But what I feel lacking at KC now is that we don't really have a lot of initiative from the bottom. As you said, that Harvard professors, they often decide what to teach and what not to teach, and I feel that we don't really have that. In a way, on the one hand, we say that Harvard is too slow and bureaucratic, but on the other hand, you see like Harvard invests a lot of money into building new building for engineers or computer scientists. So somehow they do things.
Yep.
So I was wondering whether you felt anything like that when you came to Ukraine, whether whatever I said, does it make sense to you? Do you see it? Do you see it differently? How would you find this balance between the leadership decision versus faculty decision? Can you, reflect on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think of an analogy at an American university where they start a new program, right? They start a new program. Often it's because there's a leader, a dean or a president who says, you know what, like we really need a communications college. And people will say, okay, like good idea. We think, communication is going to be important, but we don't have any money for it. And so the board tells the president, if you want to start this school, or the dean, that you have to raise the money for it. So the dean goes out to donors, maybe to some foundations, and says, we're going to have this amazing communication school. We think it's really necessary. We kind of have some market research on it, and we think we can do it really well. The donors give money, they build a building, they have a communications program.
Voila.
They don't know what they're going to teach exactly in the communications program. The dean is not saying that. And so then it's a little bit of serendipity. Who you hire will have certain interests, and that is what they're going to teach. And so you might, for example, start a law school and be known as, an amazing resource on international law and war crimes, right? Because it just so happened that that's the network of people that formed. It's the same in science. We went to go see ETH Zurich, for example, and we saw these incredible labs. And the first reaction is like, oh, we also need that $2 million machine, whatever it is. And they said, you don't buy the machine and then look for the professor. You get the professor, and then the professor tells you what machine he needs to do his research.
Exactly.
And there could be 100 different topics, but the topics that your university is going to focus on are the ones that your professors focus on. So I would think, it's more of a dialogue. And the reason that KSC doesn't have it is because in many cases, our programs are new, right? So the professors have just arrived and at first we know, okay, at a minimum, Ukrainian law tells us we have to teach these 3 classes. Let's start with that. And then they propose other classes. I do see that happening here.
Yeah. And in this scenario, who would be responsible for, kind of taking responsibility for an error? So who works on quality assurance? Is this like the board, dean reports to someone, people report to dean? How does it work in Harvard?
So usually departments or centers will have a review every 3 years, every 5 years. They'll bring in, let's say we had a sociology department and you wanted to do a review. The sociology department would say, these are 10 leading people in sociology around the world. You as the rector would invite 3 of them to come for a week and assess the program.
Yeah.
And they say, the sociology program is very good, except like you really need to cover more Weber, for example, or, your students are doing very well in their first 2 years, but you don't have enough electives to give them opportunities if they want to do PhDs or go into polling. And so it's very much a dialogue, and it's an organism, right, that changes over time. That's one form of quality, basically, like, what are you offering the students as a holistic education? But the other question of quality control of the teaching, everybody does it the way we do it, right? Which is you have surveys, maybe in the middle of the semester and at the end of the semester. And if the teacher isn't doing a good job, they get bad reviews. And the head of the department says, bro, your reviews are terrible.
Yeah, we have the same. And I think we actually sometimes overdo it because we have teaching evaluation review, kind of midterm evaluation, and in the end of the term evaluation. And we had issues with some of the American professors because they felt it like an intrusion, sort of, you hired me to teach,
right,
so why would you evaluate me in the middle of the course? But we do it for 2 reasons. One is because, we have to move fast and we hire so many people, and we hire people in Ukraine and outside of Ukraine, and not everyone is on the same page. So we must collect feedback quickly, and it's not just to punish people or fire people, it's just to get on the same page, and to give quick feedback to each other. And the second issue is because we want to work with students differently from how other universities in Ukraine work with students. So we overload them or overwhelm them with a lot of feedback. So they develop this culture of, constant dialogue. It's, I think, quite unusual for Ukraine. It is not unusual to have evaluation, but it is unusual to have a lot of evaluations in the middle, in the end of the term.
I think if you look at the culture where, you're asked to rate every boat ride, every drink, every coffee, it's completely normal for this generation to, maybe they don't have to write essays, but, 4 or 5 stars, that's normal. And I think it's also, very consistent with the KSC approach from Milovanov on down, which is we want to know if we're doing a good job. Yeah. And the only way you know that is not like your intuition, but by asking the people who are receiving what you're offering and them telling you if it's working or it's not working.
Yeah. Did you have to fire anyone based on evaluations?
Staff.
Yeah. So not teaching, but just managerial.
Teaching because as a center, I didn't hire teaching, right? Just staff. But it's pretty difficult to get fired. You would have a performance improvement plan, right? Or maybe you would have someone coaching you in the classroom. Like there would be remedial measures and the assumption that, maybe someone actually wants to teach well. They don't know how.
Sure. No, but that's how it should be. Yeah. Evaluations are not just to punish people, but to learn about the process, learning process. Well, we had to. We again, because we operate in this environment when we try to build, a new university in the country where higher education is not so well mature and developed. So and sometimes we have to move fast and we have errors. I remember when we launched new programs, we just hired some professors, with a kind of leap of trust. Like we have to launch the program fast, we have to hire everyone we can, and let's see what's going to happen. And then our students gave like a very bad teaching evaluations to some of these professors. And and we immediately fired 3 people. I remember it was very tough because I felt a lot of responsibility because basically I hired them. And so sort of it was my error that we did not ensure quality assurance in the first place.
Yeah.
But I think students were quite happy that, we reacted very fast. Although there was an issue that students felt like too empowered. So they decided that they can decide everything now. And they were sending me emails with CV of people like, you should hire this person, you should fire that person. So we spent a lot of time, just communicating with students, trying to build these boundaries. Like, okay, we listen to your feedback, which was fair, but this time we're not going to listen to your feedback, which is also fair. So it's a complicated dialogue.
Yeah, and I think, what you're coping with is a problem that universities in the United States have real trouble with, because the way that professors are hired, you're hired tenure track. So you have a long probationary period where it's relatively easy to get rid of someone if they're terrible. But once they get tenure, they're basically there for life. And unless they steal money or harass someone sexually, it's very difficult to get rid of people. Even if they do, sometimes it's difficult to get rid of people.
No.
The result is that, some people go into academia because it's not really the real world, right? Your performance does not influence whether or not you stay in your job and are allowed to do what you want. And I think that that's one of the weaknesses in American universities, is that you have people that are just not that good, that probably should have gone into a different profession, but you can't get rid of them.
Well, that's such a surprise for me, because in Ukraine, we romanticize, Western academia and American university specifically. So the basic assumption is that you guys have a very high bar in, working with faculty and students, and you're telling me that there are quite a lot of people who may not fit the university environment. So, yeah, I don't know. I never felt that. Even when I visited America as a Fulbright researcher or as a visitor, I heard things like that, but I never felt it. So, yeah, I guess.
Well, because you don't see those people. They never come into the office. Right?
Yeah, I guess.
But, again, it's part of the conversation that's happening around higher education. Like, who are these people, right, who have this kind of fantasy where they sit and read books all day and get paid for it, right? So there's a lack of understanding of
My dream job.
Scholars, everybody's dream job, right, of what scholars do. But the other problem is right now, if we look at what happens in a world where American universities can't get federal funding, it's a huge blow to overall financing of the sector. The universities are going to be hiring less people, which means that people who are getting their PhDs now, and it takes usually 5 to 7 years to get a PhD in the United States, those people won't have jobs, right? So now you're going to have PhDs who can't get jobs that they prepared for. And either they're going to have a very difficult life as an adjunct, which is where you're not really a staff member at a university, but you're just hired a low amount of money by the class, and you can basically never get tenure and never do your research and never advance, or they'll go off into some other fields.
Or they can go to Ukraine.
Or they can come to Ukraine if they're good enough. But the question is, should all of those people have been getting PhDs in the first place, right? Some of them get PhDs because, they think, and this is why I started a PhD, you're a good student, you're a smart person, then smart people get PhDs. But that's not actually a good reason to get a PhD. You have to be ready to be a productive scholar, meaning you're publishing a lot. And a lot of people romanticize the life of you're going to sit in the room and read books. And in fact, the teaching is very difficult. Working with students is difficult. You have to publish at least one high quality article every year and 1 or 2 books in the first 7 years to get tenure. And that's a very difficult job, usually at fairly low pay.
That's actually kind of the standards that we also try to follow, because, we try to follow the international standards. Like, you have to publish a paper. And, well, we're working on this new faculty handbook together, where we wrote that this paper should be evaluated by peers. So peers will tell you whether the journal is good or not, whether the paper is good or not. But in the Ukrainian system, public universities, they have to follow way more difficult benchmarks. So here in Ukraine, you have to publish 3 or 5 papers to get ahead in your career. And I think it's ridiculous, because it's very difficult to publish. So it pressures people to publish in predatory journals. So it's not really efficient. So what we try to do, we try to kind of, it's a paradox. We have conditions that are more relaxed, but we still believe that they will bring higher quality than in the governmental system. But it's a very difficult situation to manage.
There's also this tension, right? Which is that you might have people who are great teachers
Yeah,
who are not really into doing research and scholarship and publishing.
yeah,
And if your goal is to train Ukraine's future and provide a high quality education, you want those people. And I know this is something that we struggled with, right? Is that if you want to be a leading research university, then you're judged on the articles that are published by your professors. But if you want to be a leading teaching university and really be working towards the Ukrainian future, then you need to reward teachers.
yeah.
And how do you set up a system?
What if you want both?
Exactly. How do you set up a system that incentivizes and allows both without creating incentives that indirectly make one or the other less attractive?
Yeah, well, it's a bit of controversy. I mean, I have my own thoughts, but I know that it's kind of controversial. And I mean, this podcast, I guess our faculty will listen to this podcast. So I apologize in advance if I hurt someone's feelings. But I think there will be, whatever system we will set up, there will be inevitably some inequality. So even if we want to respect everyone and incentivize everyone, I still think there will be different remuneration in a way that good teachers, they deserve a lot of respect and they deserve a lot of, money because they do a lot of hard work. But I still feel that researchers will be paid more in whatever system we will set up, because research is also about kind of innovations and, doing new things in laboratory or in experiments. So it's just another, not just set of skills, but it's also something which needs more training, I think, and it's more expensive to do. So by design, there will be some inequalities, but I think the ultimate goal is still to make sure that everyone is rewarded enough. Yeah, so that's how I'm thinking about it.
And let me say, no university has figured this out, basically. So it's a very thorny problem. But I mean, the other factor is that, for all of these people, there are different markets in which they operate, right? So you could teach at KSC, or you could teach at a different university, or, you can teach maybe abroad, or you can teach middle school. And, the possible income that you can make as a teacher, someone focused on teaching, is defined by those alternatives.
Yeah.
If you happen to be a great researcher, then you could be working at KSC, or you could be working in a company, or you could be working, in an institute, and you're probably going to be paid more. And if we want to get the researchers, we need to pay them what it costs to make them worth, and to make it worth for them staying in the university and not going to the other.
Yeah, because that's how usually job market works. You pay people not only that they work for you, you pay them so they don't work for someone else.
Exactly.
So we have to understand the benchmarks and markets. So I guess we just live in the reality where, American or Canadian researchers, they have higher salaries. So if you want to hire them, you have to match their expectations.
And even, in let's say Harvard, right?
Yeah.
If you are an economics professor, you're making more than a political science professor.
Yeah.
If you're at the business school, a political scientist, you're making more than if you're in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, right? I mean, it's not the same salary for all of the people who came in at the same time at the same level. So one of the interesting questions that we're facing is, how can we attract top professors to KSC, right? It's a war. It's not an easy case to make. And yet we seem to be able to get some quite high-powered people like Nobel laureates to come to KSC, give lectures, maybe give a few classes. Like, what has been the strategy? How do you make that magic happen?
Yeah, well, behind every magic, there is a crew of people who are, doing these tricks. Now, I think it's just a combination of a lot of factors, and we have invested a lot of resources in each of these factors. So I think, first of all, KC has a long historical brand. So it's quite known among the economists, because we exist from the early 90s, like we have 30 years of history, that our alumni, they apply to international PhD programs. They teach internationally. They actually work as associate, full professors, tenured professors in American and European universities. And it really matters. It really matters because they can help us to attract talent. For instance, we actually know what job market is. Because when I was a student, a PhD student, I didn't know what it means. I actually thought that job market is some abstract thing. The job market is a metaphor, like supply and demand. But in fact, job market is an actual fair. So people come to a physical place, they hand in their CV, and they are interviewed by professors. And then they're invited to give a presentation of a paper. They are evaluated and they can receive an offer. And this offer says, you will be teaching this and this, you will have this and this expectations about research, and you'll have this and this in terms of remuneration. And you know what? Most people in Ukraine do not know how it works. So we have this unique position that we have enough of people who know how it works. So we just know how to go outside, how to hire people, how to interview them. Actually, even if we go to a restaurant with a candidate, we know how to talk to these candidates because, we have this experience. So this actually helps a lot. We just know the culture. And I think this is a factor number one. You have to know the culture. The second thing which is crucial is you have to work with opportunities. Right now, yes, there is a war, but also war provides a lot of opportunities. Ukraine is in the middle of international discussions. Quite a lot of people are motivated to support Ukraine. You just have to work with that. You can send advertisement to people who are loyal to Ukraine. You can use the networks. You can use this hype to kind of bring people in. And then, of course, it's always, sooner or later, you have to talk about money. There are quite a lot of people who are willing to donate to Ukraine. There are a lot of people who are willing to come on sabbatical, or maybe the university even doesn't allow them to take money. Like a Stanford professor cannot take our salary. So they come here for a weekend as volunteers, to teach one workshop or something like that. But sooner or later, if you really want to make a long-term relationship with people, you have to talk about contracts, you have to talk about money. And that's the thing that it is not easy to hire people because you have to provide fair remuneration. If they have a higher salary in the United States, you have to offer something equivalent or even higher because they have to give up whatever they have and come to Ukraine. So I had recently this conversation with one person who is of Ukrainian origin. He's a solid economist, like not the Nobel Prize, but solid economist who has career in United States. And basically he said that he can come to Ukraine if we cover only part of his salary. And the part of his salary was something like $80K per year, which is a lot by Ukrainian standards. So yeah, for us, it means that we have to go through a lot of negotiations. We really have to understand the profile of a person, what this person will do, what kind of engagement this person will have, how much money we have. And someone has to get this money because, we have a whole crew who works on fundraising. So it's a lot of work to accumulate these funds, just like you said, in line with what you said about Harvard, we're also a private university. So we have revenues from tuition fees, which are small. It's not what I mean that from the perspective of parents and from the perspective of kids, they pay a lot of money to study here. But from the perspective of our budget, tuition fee is just a small piece of the pie. So we also have research, I mean policy research and academic research. So we apply to a lot of grants, but also our foundation and the president of KC, they do a lot of fundraising. So we accumulate this money and then we also must have a permission to spend this money because you cannot just spend it as you want. You must align it with some strategic needs of KC. You must receive a permission from the board to spend this money. Yeah, so that's how hiring works. And hiring works either through standardized procedure, job market. Job markets, they have cycles. Faculty, they know that they have some gaps. They say, well, we need to hire a macroeconomist. So we go to the job market and we say we're looking for macroeconomists. And then sometimes we hire through what is called opportunity hire. Opportunity hire means that, there is a fantastic person and we understand that this person fits what we need. And we just use this opportunity, to talk to the person, to convince this person, to negotiate. So there is an opportunity and that's why it calls opportunity hire. Yeah, and our networks matter a lot. And it's difficult to accumulate networks, but for the last 30 years, there was few generations of KC students, alumni, managers who have collectively accumulated a huge network. Like in our board of directors and academic advisory board, we have people like Nobel laureates. Of course, having these people in our network helps us, but I have to say it's not just the name, it's not just for brand. They help us to do things. For instance, when we go to job market, our members of academic board members, they actually participate in interviews. Because, I'm a sociologist. I don't know how to interview an economist. So people from the board will conduct interview on my behalf. Or when we hire mathematicians, we also have people in the board who are professional mathematicians, and they will interview on my behalf. So it's a lot of work. There are many variables, and I feel that from what I understand, in Ukraine there are only few universities who are doing that, simply because quite a lot of universities are not so well integrated to the global context.
Yeah, I mean, I would say in this way that the way that KSC does it is similar to the way that Harvard does it or other universities, right? Which is, that you want to get the top people. You do your best to get to them in the job market, but sometimes you have opportunities that come up because someone has a Ukrainian wife, for example, or someone, just won a big prize and it feels that now they can do something different that's more meaningful.
Yep.
And at that point, you gather your resources, or you go to specific donors and you say, look, we have this opportunity. Can you help us raise the money so that we can ensure that this person can come? And it's a very intense process. It requires a lot of contacts and donor network and relationships. And even though some of them are quite long to build, I would point to, for example, the math department that we're building, and that if you bring in the right people, you can actually be very successful, right? Because you already have that aura of seriousness, that you're bringing in serious mathematicians who want to teach and who want to do research.
Yeah, and also this specific case of mathematicians, I remember there was no market exposure at all, meaning that we operate in a lot of uncertainty. So you don't know what is the salary, what is normal, what is not normal, what should we offer, is it too much, is it too low? And no one knew. I remember that it took a lot of work of different agents to come up with a strategy. So I'll tell you what I mean. So I visited several events with international stakeholders. Like there was a huge conference in Zurich with Simons Foundation and American Academy of Science and Ukrainian representatives. And they all tried to figure out what is a good salary for a postdoc in Ukraine, because no one knew. Because, if you go to European market or American market, very often the prices are visible on the websites. But the question is, how much do you pay to a person to go to Ukraine during the war? Is this like a normal salary with a premium? What if this person is a Ukrainian who wants to come back in the first place? What if there are so many open questions. And there was even a survey among potential candidates, like Ukrainians who happen to stay in Europe. And according to this survey, people said, this survey was presented at the conference. And there was idea that if it's something like 2,000 or 3,000 euro per month after taxes, we can go to Ukraine and work as postdocs. That was... And we kind of tried it out. So we worked with donors, with Simons Foundation. We established this benchmark that it can be something in between of 2,000 and 3,000 euro per month after taxes. We published it. So I understand that money is always a sensitive topic, but we made it public. We published some announcements and advertisements on the internet. And we managed to hire postdocs, international postdocs who will come to Ukraine quite soon. And also we hired some professors with higher salaries. But still, I remember that it took us basically 2 years to figure it out. And it was not only us, but there was the whole crew, some scholars in the United States, in Europe, people who conducted surveys. So I would say we wasted a lot of time just to understand one benchmark, approximate salary of a postdoc. And I think this is actually my theory. I think that this is the biggest problem for Ukrainian higher education and science. The biggest problem is uncertainty. So we have to spend a lot of time, a year or 2 years, just to understand the benchmark and then to act on this benchmark?
I would still say that things move pretty fast here.
Yeah.
I mean,
Okay.
to hire one professor in an American university could take 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
Because you need to
Wow,
announce
really,
the
2
position.
years.
You need to get the chair to approve it. You need to get the dean to approve it. The
Wow.
money has to be there. They have to do a search. I mean, I remember when I was talking to a colleague of mine at Harvard, and I said, oh, so-and-so is probably going to retire in a couple years.
Mhm.
We'll have a new person in at 3 years. And they're like, oh, no. They'll retire in 2 and you'll have a new person in 5.
I see. Oh, it's interesting that, the way I envisioned this conversation that, we can talk about some big ideas and our vision, but now I feel like it's a therapy session when we share our pain and we're just, gossiping about stuff, which I like more. I like it more. So, which leads me to another question I want to discuss.
Yes.
Since we have so many pains,
Yeah.
why not to discuss all of them?
Okay.
So everyone, I mean like parents, kids, colleagues in Ukraine are obsessed with a thing which is called accreditation.
Mm-hmm.
So as a university, we do a lot of education. So Ukrainian universities are often education based, and research is something attached to
Right.
education.
Mm-hmm.
We try to balance it. We try to be research driven university, but still education is a very big part of it. And, it's a matter of trust. When people apply to your university, they want to know whether you're good university or not good university. And the best signal here in Ukraine, the best signal on the market is accreditation. If you are accredited by some organization, therefore you're a good university. So, in my view, it's a bit superficial because, bad programs, they also can be accredited.
Mm-hmm.
And Ukrainian accreditation is a lot of bureaucracy. So we tried, and what we actually did, we received European accreditation by one German agency just to have it. Well, there is an internal debate. I mean, my view is, you see, I'm kind of talking about it just as about procedure. Some of my colleagues believe that accreditation is more than that, that accreditation is an opportunity to learn and improve your programs. So people in pedagogy, they take it very seriously sometimes, that accreditation is not just a piece of paper, it's like a survey, it's audit of a program, and you can learn a lot and you can improve the program. So yeah, so basically what I'm trying to say that it occupies a huge place in my mind. It takes a lot of my time, and I wonder how it works in American universities and Harvard specifically.
So it will depend on the program. For example, engineering programs are accredited by the engineering people, and medical schools are accredited by medical boards and things like that. But it's basically a similar situation. You get an accreditation for a certain period. You can't do it until you have a class that's graduating. So it's entirely consistent with the fact that we got accreditation for a program that's 4 years old. And of course, it's very stressful for everyone involved because you need to produce all of the syllabi. You need to kind of explain all of your procedures. And I personally think it's quite healthy. I mean, it's not my problem, so I can afford to say it's healthy because it's your problem. But it does force people to think about their procedures. And when you get feedback, then you're like, okay, like now we really have to change this. And as an example, I would say that, I saw the report that the German agency wrote, and they had said, your program is very good, you're doing excellent teaching, but it's a problem that you don't have a clear policy on sexual harassment.
Yeah.
Right? And they were right.
Yeah.
Right? And now you have a reason. Okay, let's put up those signs now in all of the bathrooms or in the cafeteria. There are signs saying, if you've been harassed or abused, like here's a number you can offer resources and here are the policies. I think that's quite useful.
Fun fact. So I participated in this accreditation process. I was interviewed, as it should be. They interviewed students, faculty, leadership. And I remember talking to them, I was almost bragging. There was one thing that I was really proud of, and that was the fact that we have people from industries who also teach at KC, because it's so cool that we are connected to industries. But, we have these programs in political science, governance. So I was bragging that, people from government, they also come and teach. And for German counterparty, people who interviewed us, it was almost like a red flag. They perceived it like something ideological, like maybe we're too cozy with the government, and maybe people from the government come to our students, to kind of influence or nudge them or something. So Germans were very polite. They were asking questions like, so how do you ensure in your educational process that kind of indoctrination does not happen? And I even did not understand the question. It took me, they repeated the question many times before I answered it. So I was kind of surprised. Do you have anything like that in Harvard, like some ideological debates? Who has to teach, like professors of practice, people from government?
What is very common, however, is when people go out of government, which can happen every 4 years, that many of them become professors of the practice at school. So, for example, we have the Kennedy School of Government, and every 4 years there's a huge traffic of people coming in or going out to go back into the government. And one of the reasons that people do go into government is because they know that after 4 years, let's say, they'll be able to go back into a sector that's actually going to pay them what they're worth as opposed to what they're earning in government. So it's pretty typical to have movement back and forth.
I actually learned that you even have a special term for it. You call it revolving doors.
Yes.
Yes.
And it's not just into universities.
Yeah.
Right.
That's were two things that I learned from my political science class: revolving doors and pork barrel. I really love these two things.
Yeah.
Yeah. So actually, we talked a lot about that. And we see it also as a strategy. We do it on purpose. We actually want to create the culture of revolving doors in Ukraine. Because the way we see it, there is a very big problem with government in Ukraine, that there is no incentive for good people to go and work in government. Because government is basically a suicidal job. So a typical candidate...
A low-paying suicidal job. Yeah.
There are a lot of people from business or NGO sector who are very smart, very ambitious. They have energy, they can go to government and they can change things. But it also means that they have to quit their jobs for, let's say, 2 or 4 years. They will have a lot of negative reputation in media because no one likes reforms and changes. And then after they finish their job, their tenure, no one will hire them because they were outside of market for 4 years. So their resume is like, how can you explain this gap of 4 years in your resume? Oh, you worked with government, but you lost some track in our industry. So it's very difficult. So there is no incentive for good people to go to the government in the first place. And one of the ways we try to mitigate it is by signaling that there are such things as revolving doors. You can go to the government, but then after 4 years, you can go to our university and you'll have decent salary. You can teach, you will take like a sabbatical 1 or 2 years, and then you'll be back on your feet. Yeah, I think that a lot of people in Ukraine see it through more controversial lines as a controversy, but we see it as a strategy.
Yeah, and I mean, I think as long as it's not illegal, right? Yeah. There's no problem with it. What I think is important is to have transparency.
Yeah.
Right, so that it's not a secret that someone is also working at KSE.
Yeah,
it's known. It's actually something that we're proud of. And there's nothing kind of nefarious happening here.
Yeah.
It's compensation for work that's being done.
Yeah, interesting. I think there is a difference, between Harvard and KC, the local legislation. Yeah, so in Ukraine, people who are in parliament and in government, they are allowed to have some income, but it is regulated. You can teach, you can write monographs, but that's kind of it. So we can hire them, but it should be within the limits of what is allowed. Yeah. And then whatever happens after they are retired or fired, I mean, it's more like a typical market situation.
Right.
Yeah. I think we have discussed a lot, but maybe just to summarize, how do you feel, to what extent Harvard and KC are different or similar?
Yeah, it's a good question. Obviously, there's a difference in size, right? Harvard has tens of thousands of students, and KSE has 1,000 and may end up with 2 or 3 times that. Although I think that that's an advantage, right? There's a certain agility that we have that a huge historical entity like Harvard cannot have. But if you look at the similarities, both are private, right? Both are independent. Both are able to set their own course, subject, of course, to governance from the international board or from faculty with input from students. Like all of that is completely normal. The stakeholders are basically the same between KSE and Harvard. I would say that the atmosphere or the vibe here, however, is very different to respond to situations. So, of course, the big situation is the war. And a lot of what we do is oriented towards either mitigating the effects of the war or anticipating what's going to be needed after the war. But it also means that if something isn't working, we shut it down and we do something else. Whereas at Harvard, like in most bureaucracies, it's very difficult to do that because there's a lot of momentum. There are a lot of people who are invested in a program. There might be a tail of funding that's difficult to interrupt. And so you end up with a lot of legacy type programs that limit your ability to meet the moment. And because KSC is young and agile and well-funded and private and independent and well-connected to international circles, it's able to react much faster. And for me, as I consider myself an innovative administrator, it's a much more gratifying place in which to work because you have an idea and you can put it into action.
Yeah, well, I hope your colleagues from Harvard are not upset that you find.
I've invited them to join us, right?
Yeah, no, cool. Thanks for sharing. I think it's, I really appreciate what you said. Yeah, I agree. I've been to Harvard only as a visitor, only as a guest. Of course, I was impressed with the size and, with the prestige and with legacy. Yeah, I would agree that we try to follow the standards of kind of being private university, which offers relevant programs and hire people on international markets. That's what we try to achieve. But I agree that we are in position to do things a bit more faster and flexible just because we live in a country and in this age when, it's necessary. So yeah, we try to learn from Harvard and other top private universities. Yeah, but still some things we will do differently. Yeah.
And the world will be different, right? I mean, when we look at technological innovation, whether it's AI or robotics or things like that, I mean, it's going to be a problem for big institutions to pivot and respond to them. And so, for example, when we think of the discussions we have about AI, like how can we integrate them into building syllabi and engaging students, almost the same day, I get an email from my colleagues at Harvard that says, should we allow students to use AI or not? Right. So in a way where there are certain areas where we're far ahead in terms of the conversation than the bigger, older, well-established, very successful universities.
So I'll take this conversation as an opportunity to run an advertisement.
Yes.
I'll say that if you work at Harvard or you graduate from Harvard, please join KSC. We are also a nice private university. We're a bit smaller, but we have a nice vibe. You'll be fine here. Yeah, so join us. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for coming to Ukraine during the war and working at KSC. It's fantastic to have you, and we all learn a lot from you. So thanks a lot.
I'm so happy to be here.